Hey guys, this is Infinite Flash here. Today I'm going to be talking about what happened in round 6 of the Sinquefield Cup played yesterday in St. Louis. In this game we have Hikaru Nakamura playing Levon Aronian, and without further ado, let's begin. E4 played by Nakamura. Aronian is exclusively an E5 player, and after this we get a pretty typical Ruy Lopez, pretty much the Berlin variation, which is pretty much given white zilch in the main lines, and after a knight takes e4, the most popular option is d4 when you get this famous endgame position, knight f5, and I mean everybody. I think we all saw this in the what was it, the Anand Carlsen World Championship match. And in this position, instead of d4, we saw rook e1 played, kind of a sideline, and after knight d6, the same thing. White decided to take on e5, and in this case, black is unable to take the bishop because white would have this check right over here, discovered check, and black is actually losing the queen here on d8. So you would need to probably just defend here with bishop e7. Certainly knight takes e5 was possible, but I think after rook takes e5 check and bishop e7, white would probably have queen e2 or queen e1, putting pressure on the bishop on e7. But you don't even want to, let's say, leave your king in the center for too long. And after bishop e7, white decided to drop the bishop back here. You may be wondering why not just knight takes c6 and pawn takes c6, doubling the pawn right over here, when white would have to drop the bishop back here. And you may be wondering, why is this any good for black? But the thing is, these double pawns are not that bad for black. He can probably push c5, control the d4 square, and he has the open d file against this d pawn. He can probably play some. His play is going to revolve around these two squares, trying to attempt to block the d pawn over here once it advances. Black is doing fine in my opinion. In this position, after bishop e7, white just decided to bring the bishop back here, and we soon get a bunch of trades here. Castles, knight c3 developing, knight e8 retreating, trying to push the d pawn at some point. White played knight d5 to try and negate the bishop pair, and this kind of position with bishop f6 would allow white to capture here, and this position's quite fine, probably d4, and white has the two bishops and a nice space, let's say center. I want to say like place in the center. I mean, so instead of bishop f6, black ideally wants to keep the bishop here wants to keep the bishop on the board, then rather than let white trade it off for the knight right here. So he played bishop d6, gaining a tempo on the rook. White decided to move the rook back to e2. A very strange spot, by the way. Usually white plays rook e1, and certainly that position's fine. Certainly fine for white. No reason why Nakamura couldn't play that. Instead, he played rook e2. Black played c6. White retreated the knight to e3. It doesn't really want to go to, let's say, the c3 square when on e3 it can probably jump to the f5 square or g4 squares at some point. Black decided to retreat the bishop back here. Certainly, bishop c7 is also worthy of consideration, but I think on e7 he can kind of keep this option of going to f6, controlling this diagonal. And if you're on c7, sure, you can go to this diagonal, but if you go to, let's say, c7, you're kind of forced to go to this e5 square if you want to go on this diagonal, and there's always the potential for discovered attacks if you have this bishop undefended here. And okay, bishop c7 is not that bad either, but I think this is either is fine. White played queen e1, threatening knight f5, trying to get this check over here, no matter what happens. And I think we see this with bishop f6, knight f5. Black takes some space in the center, and we see white's plan with knight e7 coming to fruition. And in this position, Aronian decided to play king h8, a quite fine move, but he can also consider taking the knight over here. And after rook takes e7, unfortunately he cannot play bishop e6, trapping the rook, because white actually can take here, and actually white wins in this position probably. So instead, this kind of explains black's logic in playing knight c7, because now he's threatening either minor piece going to the e6 square and trapping the rook then. So in this position, white would probably have to drop the rook back, and black would probably develop normally, attacking the c2 pawn here on with the bishop on f5. White has to probably defend it, and after knight e6, black has a very, very comfortable share of space in the center and good piece activity. He should be fine in that position. In this position, though, Aronian decided to play king h8. White took one of the bishops here. He has the bishop pair, probably a slight advantage. It's nothing serious, though, and both sides just continue, let's say, making pawn moves, trying to find open lines for the bishops. Black is trying to mobilize his forces. Probably knight comes to d6 or goes to c7 to e6 in this kind of position, trying to influence the center. The positions are roughly equal. Black decided to play knight c7, and in this position, I think Aronian pretty much plays a really weird move. He played queen a5, not a bad move, but it's just kind of weird. And Aronian, okay, I guess Nakamura, one idea was just to attack the pawn, but Aronian just played rook f e8, and one idea I guess, okay, and he played queen a5, and after rook e8, what's kind of embarrassing for Nakamura is that he just decided to go back here and saw that there's no constructive plan with queen a5. One idea that you can consider is queen takes a7, but the problem with this move is that I think white-black can probably just take here, and after bishop takes rook e8, attacking the bishop, you can't go bishop e3 because of d4, winning a piece, and you have to probably move the bishop over here to f3. And the natural move is rook e1, but the problem with this move is that after king g2, white always has this annoying idea of bishop g4, and combined with threats over here, trying to threaten and muster up threats against the back row here, and well, it's quite annoying to deal with these threats. So this kind of explains Black's next move. This is not the game, by the way. This is still a, let's say, sub variation. And after knight b5, probably I don't know, queen a5 defending the e1 square is pretty natural, and knight d4 centralizing the knight. This kind of position might arise where clearly Black is doing fine. So that kind of explains the logic, and I don't think Nakamura really liked seeing Black activate all those pieces, getting the knight to d4 right over here, Black pushing the h-pawn. This kind of variation I bet he was looking at. So he decided to retreat the queen. But after this move, I think, what was it? Rook takes e2, trying to trade off one rook, bringing the other rook to e8. Queen takes here. And instead of rook e8 first, he just decided to prevent c4 by, let's say, taking his own space in on the flank right over here, trying to prevent white's moves, taking space. It's just kind of nice to take space. c3 played by white, trying to take his own space in the center, but Black decides to prevent this. And if you play a move like bishop d2, I don't think Black really minds attacking the d3 pawn in this position, or let's say leaving the weak pawn over here to attack. There are many ways of approaching the position, but if white develops the bishop here, but I think the move played by Nakamura is fine, and c4 pushing the pawn in the center, and okay, this gives the Black the option of taking here on c4, so rook e8, queen d1, bishop, pawn takes pawn, and Black has the pass pawn. Black has really no problems in this position, and after knight e6, which is a fine move, Black could have also played knight a6, let's say, playing knight c5, controlling the pawn push from here on b4. Also, when the knight reaches here, you can also try to open and push the pawn here with the knight nicely supporting the pawn here. Also, the knight can go to e4 if it's on c5. Quite, more multi-purposeful knight that you would have there. Instead, Aronian decided to play knight e6, and in this position, Nakamura played b4. And, here, I think Aronian makes a slight inaccuracy. In this position, he played d3, properly advancing the center, but I think it's not well timed. In this position, I think he should play the pawn push c5. First, let's say, fixing the pawn here on c4, supporting his pawn here on d4, and of course, if white plays b5, you have a nice protected pass pawn. Black is doing fine. And, it's not really that clear what white does here in the center. And a move like a3 gives Black a very, very pleasant option of playing rook c8 or rook d8, supporting both of his pawns, threatening here to, let's say, put some pressure on the pawn. Black can also consider a5, trying to block the position, although that might not be the best option, but Black is generally okay in this kind of position. This is definitely, I would say, better than what could have than what happened, and well, that didn't happen actually, strangely enough. In this position, as I said, Aronian continued with d3, and after rook b1, since the bishop was attacking the rook, the problem is this pawn is really weak. Black plays rook d8 because there were two attackers here, and in this position, I think Nakamura missed a slight chance to get a pretty good game in this position. In the game, he played bishop d2, and the problem is this is just not active enough, and this just lets the game fizzle out very quickly. And what he should do is bishop e3, making sure he puts the bishop not in front of the pawn, but on the side, where he can try to rely on the open d-file for his queen to attack the pawn, the bishop to attack the pawn, and now the rook can swing over here to try to collect the pawn. Black has a really, really difficult time to try to save this pawn, and this bishop actually controls the d4 square, which we'll see is very, very important in one sideline. For example, if Black plays bishop g5 trying to trade the bishop in this position, White can play f4, and we'll see why this is important. And basically now in the game, Nakamura played bishop d2, Aronian played bishop g5, and the problem is, in this kind of position, White can't play f4 kicking away the bishop because Black would have queen d4 check, and the king has to run over here. And I suspect after bishop f6, Black has really, really nice control. White has a weak c4 pawn, a nice, really, really nice d3 pawn. White is very much struggling in this position. After bishop g5, I think Nakamura just defended here, planning to make bishop takes with rook takes d2, and this is certainly fine, but Aronian just centralized the queen. Another reason that you want your bishop on e3, controlling the d3 square. If the bishop was here, the queen would have never made it to d4. And the rook is attacked too, so Nakamura had to move the rook again, and the game pretty much fizzles out from here with a bunch of captures and takes, rook takes, I think, queen takes a2, queen d7, threatening mate, so king g8 makes some sense. Queen takes, g6 preventing a back row. Notice that he's putting a pawn, making this hole in the g7 square, all these dark squares, so purposely kind of playing against the color of this bishop. And after bishop c4, queen b1, king g2, takes here, we get a bunch of trades, and eventually you reach this. I don't think queen takes e6 was played for some reason, but you kind of get this very, very dead drawn kind of position where each side has 3 pawns, and they just agreed to a draw after these series of repetition of moves. So overall, not a very exciting game. Few opportunities missed by each side. Aronian definitely pushed d3 too early, and bishop g2 is kind of a slight error on Nakamura's part. I think he should just go with bishop e3 instead and try to round up the d3 pawn with rook b3 and try to attack there. But otherwise, the game started equal and probably a very fair result given the dull opening where the symmetrical structure basically leads to hardly anything for White. Yeah, and I guess a fair result. Not much else to say. Both pretty well played game by both guys, and this kind of makes sense. Aronian was suffering yesterday, I think, against Carlsen, or suffering in the last game of the last round versus Carlsen. Maybe he wanted maybe a safe game for the first round today of let's say the second half of the tournament. And Nakamura, of course, was lost a very, very, let's say, taxing game versus Caruana, so it's kind of understandable that he would be kind of satisfied with the draw and didn't really take any risks in this very, very dull opening. So anyways, guys, hope you liked this video. Thanks for watching. This is Infinite Flash signing out.